Welcome back to Trapezoids in the Human Figure. This will be part 2. I want to start out this video with a really great quote from Gist of Art by Sloan, where he is writing about drawing, and he writes in part, and this is extremely poignant to the conversation. He says to somebody, to a student writing about the figure, he says, "Get the solid geometry of the form. Avoid doughy construction. It destroys the measurements by which you realize the solid. You should know what a cross-section would look like." So when we think about a cross-section, we normally kind of sort of think about a top view and a cross-section, which is why we started with the trapezoid being seen from plan view. And if you'll recall in the previous video, the cuts that were made to create the trapezoids were done in plan view only. What I want to do in this video is discuss different concepts of trapezoid, different constructions, a front view construction, a side view construction, and of course more complexity on plan view, and see how we can contend with that. In order to make this as clear as I can make it for the viewer, and just because it's fascinating, I decided to make a clay model, so that's what I have here. I started out with prescribed proportions that are given to us and handed down to us from Bridgman, essentially things like 8 units high for the pelvis, 10 wide for the pelvis, 6 deep for the pelvis, a different proportion in the rib cage. We know it's going to be 12 high, it's going to be 10 wide, it's going to be 8 deep. And then with the human head, it's 8 high, 7.5 deep, and then 6 wide. So I start with that, and then I taper it. I cut it back. So I made a cut here, and I made a cut there, and you can see I try to echo the drawing that we have in the earlier study. And you can also see, if you look very carefully, that there is a subtle change in the light read coming from this light source and really scraping along the edge of that pelvis. Take note of the pelvic tonality, especially in, I'll just point to it, this plane here versus the side plane on the rib cage. You can see how one catches more light, so that has a huge effect on the development of a tonality in a figure, in the cast, in anything. Reading that solid geometry of the cross-section and avoiding doughy construction. So I've got the same thing happening in the head, and this is essentially a starting point, three-dimensional template for me that I can then cut into and experiment in drawing form as we go forward into the video. So this will be a little more subtle, but I think it's highly provocative stuff. Vanderpoel deserves a lot of attention, a lot of credit for what he's done, and I intend to try to make his diagrams come to life as best I can. So let's get started with the video. So what I'm doing now is looking at multiple trapezoids. What I had before was a trapezoid a lot like that. Turn up, turn out like this. What I'm looking at now, though, is a form which we can see from Vanderpoel. When we think about the pelvis, we can see that there's another kind of taper. So what I want to create at this juncture is a cut in my block, and that's what I'm going to do. So I'm getting down here to make sure it's symmetrical. And I'm going to block it out in such a way that I can appreciate the immense width of the top of the pelvis, and yet the narrowing and the squaring out of the bottom of the pelvis. And just keep it simple and make it a straight up cut. I can't do the same thing with the rib cage because the rib cage itself has a signature form. It widens out right around the 10th rib, which we can generally estimate to be close to the bottom, and then it goes on this long narrowing journey. So it's going to look a lot like that. And like a big giant kneaded eraser, if I get my cut wrong, I just go back in and replant my thinking until I get it symmetricized, or whatever the right word is. So cross-blending these cuts is going to make it a far more complex endeavor, especially when I go into the drawing and try to make the drawing mimic what I'm attempting to do in the sculpture. So let me do my cuts, and I will come back and explain them. Alright, so at this point in time, what I have made is a crossing taper. So if we take a look at these two toothpicks for a minute, we can see in essence that we have a wider top and a more narrow bottom, just like this. At the same time, we also have a wider front and a more narrow back. So if I turn this up to make it cross-sectional, and then I try to echo that with these two toothpicks here and here, and of course we can see what is happening. It's much more complicated. It's much more difficult to see. And so as I turn it, it's important to be able to comprehend it, because I've tried to keep it as simple as I possibly can. And in the process of that, it's more the kind of thing that we want to get around to in order to comprehend. Because it's not a simple matter of just cutting an ice cube and cutting a taper. We have standards and proportions that we have to adhere to. The underside is a certain configuration comprised of multiple triangles, as well as a posterior edge or facet or aspect, and not to mention the anterior side. But the anterior is the easiest to see, and that's why that is significant. Elsewhere in the same structure, we have ribcage, which I recognize fully is a little strange at this moment, but first things first, keep it simple, keep it comprehensible. So let me take these same two toothpicks and replant them up here and up here. So if I make them long enough, we will see the essence of the trapezoid itself, which is to taper down to a triangle. These almost have it. In fact, if I extend them just a bit further, they do indeed turn into a triangle, thus expressing the taper, where the back part of this form, you can see, is wider than the front part. So I can carry this almost all the way up. Hopefully that is clearly expressive of what I'm after. Maybe this is more so. And by the same measure, I have the expressed interest of this crossing taper, where I carry myself down to a wide spot and up to a more narrow zone or juncture. I haven't cut anything else, and that's why this ribcage looks a little strange, among other things. Try to keep its geometry clear, and you know, that means sacrificing certain realistic looks to the form temporarily. So the third, which we already have essentially dealt with, is the head. We dealt with it this way. We said, well, the front part is tapering, and we know this from a portrait, all the way back to a moment that is called Parietal Eminence, right about here on the cranium, and then suddenly I reverse direction and I taper backwards, rather. So let me turn that. And once more, kind of express that with this toothpick. So you can see these two toothpicks crossing each other. That's already been dealt with. The thing that hasn't been dealt with yet is the notion of that combined with this. Another truth to the form, which is its natural, wider top, more narrow base, somewhat like the pelvis. little more top heavy on the head, like the pelvic form, kind of top heavy if we think of it as a singular geometry absent the hips. Very different than if you add the hips, in which case you flip it. So, that being said, the effort now is to instill this into the drawing, you see. So we'll put it into the drawing, and then we'll explore this initial second cut, and then see what else we can do with the other orthographic projection on the figure. So as this happens, I can increasingly take out bits and pieces. And you see what I have here is just a really nice little trapezoid, now being seen nearly all the way through. So you see that longer form trapezoid shape, just like how I made the cut a minute ago. I'm just going to cut this back generally. So I don't quite have it where I can completely see the other side of this ribcage block, but I'm close. And I'm close enough that I can use the model of it and become more inspired by the spirit of it to see the other side, in a manner of speaking, meaning that I can conceptualize seeing this side. All I would have to do is rotate that conceptually a little bit to actually see the tapering side. Here is the tapering side on our edge of things, from our point of view. Again, as I take away some of this other stuff. So let's do the same thing up here. I can keep it simple for the time being and just pull this up, which pretty much gives me a sense of truth to what the form is doing. So now what I've gone for is a taper from wider back to more narrow front, wider posterior to narrow interior in cranial form, which is very true. You can see it here. I've done the same kind of thing, but in looking at the front view orthographic projection, I'm able to conceptualize that this is our wide point, meaning that one trapezoid goes this way to lift up to the cranial form, the other trapezoid drops and becomes synonymous with the chin. Those are incredibly impactful on how the value, the tone, the planes are going to be conceived going forward. So let's next explore that. is to build the sensibility into the side plane of the figure from here across. So you see me developing over time, gradually pushing a lighter value across to really correspond to something kind of like that. In the grand scheme of things, it should translate into a broad or a breadth of transition across this area. And it's of course a very subtle game because this has to be balanced with all of that. But in essence, we want to see taper. That's what this is all about. And we want to see taper specifically up into the neck region. So I continue to explore the value consistency, the value connection, all the way up to this, so that I see as much of a side sensibility here as I notice and through here. The difference is, in areas such as this one, I'm going to be seeing the form cut under slightly. As it cuts under, it gets darker, just like here. As it pulls up to a topish plane, it will catch more light, and I want to see the light be caught up in areas like this, even though they are very pronounced side planes, side taper. So there's a moment here, probably right about there, where things are really turning the corner. So I'm going to take it upon myself to craft an effective transition, strong side region, and then as well something that I can reinforce in this area, that area, and up and through here, and just to finish up down and through there a little bit more in terms of a refined value. Once I get that refined value, I can go back to the block construction and cut it again, and then do some more analyzing. So I'm about to work up a construct for this right side, enough to show some of what I'm going after with the appendages, but obviously not as much as the core figure, because the topic of this discussion and this demonstration really is the core and the sort of central guiding forms, the major forms, the grand forms. But nevertheless, I can see more and more as the drawing goes on that we need some explanation in here, so I'm going to attempt to do that now. So I just want to explain a couple of things that I've done to the drawing, which I'm hoping will clarify what is developing on the left side. I have spent the last few minutes on this right side just working up a construct. It's a kind of edited version of what's on the left side. There are things that are being driven. As a matter of fact, I went back and refined some of these decisions about the head. You know, the constructs are in service to observational drawing. So if I had placed a block, and I did here before, and wasn't too happy with it, then I just, guess what, adjust the block. So I have done that. I've reinterpreted the corner, this big phrase that I call the corner of the form, which is a really, really important thing for ascertaining proximity of forms to your eye and how you treat forms in space as you draw via tonality, hatch mark, all those sorts of decisions. So I've rethought the corner of the form here. I didn't really like what I had as much on this side because I kept seeing quite a bit of the human figure over on this lateral plane. So I built out the, the side plane, the taper, on this trapezoid cross section, and it's getting closer. It's getting more in sync with what I'm trying to the point I'm trying to bring across, which is that we can't just look at blocks. We have to contend with the idea that forms are either getting wider in nature or they're getting more narrow. Everything is like that. Everything is built like that. So to continue, we've got that, we've got this part. The underside is very clear. There's a center, there's a linkage right here in the back center or posterior, we could call it spinal column construct. And then we visit this or revisit this, and we're building out to these other forms, the thigh, the hip, and our eye really benefits from noticing the locations of some of these other types of corners. So the slight lateral rotation that I've got on that figure from this vantage point, I can indicate here and then go back and revisit my drawing with and ask myself, do I have the right kinds of notations to carry the form of the thigh almost in an abducted sense as it's moving along this sort of plane of motion as it rotates. So that's what those are useful for. Here again we see some specific amount of taper. We know this is true because we can see it here. The knee is narrowing, and we know that there's a pretty massive cut on the medial side of the condyle in anatomical structure and anatomical theory. As we descend, we notice still more tapers guided by blocks, that is, seeing the ground plane, which is block-like, seeing the build-out of the essential form, which is block-like. And then as we start to look more carefully at the topography, we notice that we can see some medial sides as well as some lateral sides. So there must be some taper, like we would see in a human nose or something like that. Same thing is true in this upper region with the appendages. We've got essentially the anterior part of the bicep. We've got some inside plane or inside side kind of construct there showing itself, as well as the outside. Classic way of seeing the bicep is in that capacity. And then we have something on this posterior plane of the forearm, guided by radius. So those are all really key elements. They're tells, they're signals and signs that I want to embed in this drawing. And so hopefully that goes a little further toward explaining what's being dealt with here. The next thing I want to do is to return to the sculpture and look at the indications from lateral orthographic projection, from lateral view or side view, what sorts of cuts I can make out from Vanderpool, instill those in the blocks themselves, the clay blocks, as a matter of demonstration, sort of behind the thinking kind of stuff, and then go back into this again and treat the tonality so that it can accentuate or at least acknowledge those essential tapers. The focus now is going to be on the side cuts, the side tapers. So what I want to do is identify some places to go to create essentially some changes, like that sort of change, as well as other types of things that are going to be kind of sort of simple but very necessary. We can see the width here is entirely unreasonable, unrealistic for the human rib cage. So I'm going to take some off of that. I'm going to take some off of this to finally get down to that kind of relationship of the anterior of the rib cage versus the posterior of the rib cage. And then I'm going to cut back in that direction. That's just for the trunk. I also want to address some of what's happening here, as well as, and I'm out of toothpicks, some of what's happening up and through there. So I'm going to make a few of these cuts. And then show them on the drawing that is on the right side of the paper. And then address them in tonality on the left side. So the purpose of this one, as we've talked about in class quite a few times, is to denote the fact that the absolute anterior edge is not the top of the ilia, of the ilium bone or innominate bone. We need a small amount of acknowledgement of the lift. So I started out 3/4 from the top, just about, just to indicate that. Pretty good thing to do when we have things like the external oblique coming in and influencing what's going on. Next thing I want to do is address the ribcage. So the flat back view is obviously way incorrect. It's not like this. So why do it? Reason to put it together, I think, is to explore the variety of form in other surfaces. Because if this, all things being equal, stays flat, it stays connected to the block. It stays connected to the the container space that it starts out as being and is so convenient as. So I just thought this entire volume looked like it was just a little too weird in its natural state, and resolved to take some of this and remove it. I think that's a good decision, because what it does is it repositions the arrangement of the arms further back, honestly, toward the posterior edge of this volume, which is what we want to be visualizing anyway as we draw the figure. The arms coming from the side, but really kind of from the back, because they do emanate from the scapular area. So you can see that much better view. So I've done this, and I've attempted to take just a small amount from the anterior here, and I did that in accordance with the widest part. I just decided to do it as a matter of convenience, not to make it too insanely complicated. So the next thing to do is to take that all-important plane that will be up here and remove that. So now, once again, we are able to see, it becomes evident to all, that there is so much taper to the human body in the way that we maneuver from this posterior edge down or inferior toward the anterior side over here. Likewise, from the base here up to that region, which we could pretty much associate with the costal arch of the figure. And by cutting this, we're able to see a much greater sense of the neck region as it as it would appear logically to manifest itself. So that's pretty much sufficient for showing what it is the intention of this lesson is trying to get across. We could take this a lot further. As it stands, we should probably do some repositioning, because by lopping that off, we sort of go out of alignment a little bit, but not too worried about that. I think there's a kind of basis of truth in this to the purposes intended. So I want to turn my attention next to going there, and then finally going back into the ongoing drawing. Alright, so what I've just done is I restored some of the side plane here and on there, and I did that so that I could flip the plane. I had the construct, the block itself, positioned so that it was extended. You remember the belly thing, the whole post being led by the stomach. And yet we can also see, we notice that there's a small amount of the top of this form. So I just ran my tapering long side indication up, articulated a new corner, found another moment, drew across the width axis with a construction line and echoed the other pieces, and then tapered down toward the anterior, the anterior front, the place where we normally see generally the neighborhood of the suprasternal notch. So this gives us that surface that everybody is always talking about, that people are usually confused with, because they see the underside of a form, but they also see the top of the same form. So this should articulate that both can be present, and both frequently are present in the human figure. I did some, obviously some things to the head as well, the under and top sides of the pelvis. So with that being said, I want to turn my attention now to the treatment of the value range along the front of the figure and what that means. So now, where we stand is we have internal interests guiding external appearances. So I'm going to spend a few minutes exploring those aspects of the sculpture that appear to be better comprehended through the cuts that I just made. So let's get rolling. So the effort is underway here to make this drop just like that trapezoid plane right there, drop in toward the body. The body catches at a moment right about like there, and then we pop a lighter light, even though there's no real highlight in existence that looks just like that. We know because we can go up and palpate the form and feel the corner here. As the corner drives in, we know that the form is really peaking at that line, at that moment. So it's a pretty big deal, because that same phenomenon exists in through here. Now I've gone in just a small amount and worked off of Vanderpool's neck perimeter, neck cross contour, and I haven't really pursued it much further than that, but I did want to make a note to mention that at the end of this video, which is essentially where we are. All of this is just give and take, you know, using tonality, thinking about light direction, but mainly thinking about form, and form guided by trapezoids and cross sections and things of that nature. So as all of this pulls further and further together, I find myself thinking in the middle tonalities, using the middle tonalities as much as I possibly can to benefit the drawing, because that's really where it lives in this particular light situation. We've got a lot of foreshortening, we've got a lot of darker top planes, a lot of dark top planes in through here, probably from the dirt and the cast, the local color on the cast itself, but certainly also because we've made cuts and we've conceptualized further backward in depth types of surfaces in the cast. What else? We've got features like the side kind of encroaching on the front, and then we localize that little bit of light, especially here, which is a pretty fabulous little place to take a light. You know, examples abound of that same kind of thing happening in other parts, other regions, and otherwise, you know, variations within the figure. So we've got a lighter business right there. We've got something that should be a little lighter here, top of the patella. We've got some shadow shape that is becoming very useful in crafting a more complete realization of what's going on. And then in the last little bit here, I just want to make sure that I bring this to enough of a resolution that it feels complete. It's not a focal point right here, but it is an important area because we've grounded the figure here for the entire time. And that gesture was so important and remains so. As long as the gesture can be maintained and the structure can build upon it, there should be a lot to go back to. And it's clear to see that many things are at play in a drawing like this, and many things are being kept poignant because it's a matter of preserving that which is really working effectively for the cast, even as the drawing is brought into another chapter in the timeline. A little bit of that shadow right there, dropping in to separate the figure from the ground. And I think we can just about call that a drawing, at least a study that gets the point across. So if anybody is thinking about lessons learned and takeaways from a presentation like this, I think it's really important to remember the entire guiding principle of this drawing, and indeed of many pursuits, is the fact that the body does not conveniently enclose itself in simple variations of rectangle. There's a lot more to it than that, and the notion of really solving the riddle of the figure has a lot to do with these crossing routes of trapezoids. It's not simply a trapezoid, it's many that are overlapping each other or cutting through one another, and the search for how to figure that out is long, but the benefits are potentially huge because one can get directly into anatomy and really conceptualize much more effectively because of the three-dimensionality of a model, or at least of the ideal. So I hope that was helpful.